Title: Dr. Mengele, The Horrifying Experiment of Auschwitz. Introduction. The Doctor of Death in the long and terrible history of the 20th century. Few names inspire as much dread as Josef Mengele. To the outside world, he was a well-educated physician, a man with a doctorate in medicine and anthropology, a scientist who believed he was serving his country. But inside the barbed wire fences of Auschwitz II-Birkenau, prisoners knew him by another name, the Angel of Death. With a white coat, polished boots, and a calm smile, he stood on train platforms deciding who would live and who would die. Children, mothers, elderly men, entire families were separated with the simple motion of his gloved hand. Left meant forced labor. Right meant the gas chambers. But for some prisoners, the fate that awaited them was even worse. They would become subjects of experimentation. And under Mengele's cold gaze, science became something monstrous. Part 1. The making of a Nazi Dr. Josef Mengele was born in 1911 in Günzburg, a quiet Bavarian town. His family was wealthy. His father owned a successful manufacturing company. Young Joseph grew up surrounded by privilege and opportunity. He was intelligent and ambitious. At university, he studied medicine and anthropology, eventually working under Ottmar von Verschuer, a scientist obsessed with heredity and racial classification. In 1930s Germany, these ideas were not fringe theories. They were becoming state ideology. When Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party rose to power, racial science became a central part of their worldview. They believed humanity was divided into biological hierarchies. At the top stood the so-called Aryan race. Everyone else was considered inferior. Doctors and scientists were recruited to prove these ideas. Mengele embraced them eagerly. He joined the Nazi Party and later the Schutzstaffel, the elite force responsible for enforcing Nazi racial policies. For him, medicine and ideology were merging into one dangerous path. Soon, war would give him the opportunity to put his theories into practice. Part 2. Arrival at Auschwitz in 1943. Josef Mengele arrived at Auschwitz II-Birkenau. By then, Auschwitz had already become the largest killing center in Nazi-occupied Europe. Trains arrived day and night from across the continent. Inside each train were hundreds of prisoners, mostly Jews, but also Roma, political prisoners, and others labeled enemies of the Reich. When the train doors opened, chaos began. Screaming guards, barking dogs, blinding floodlights, and there, calmly observing everything, stood Mengele. Witnesses remembered his elegance, his immaculate uniform, his polite tone. He would sometimes whistle classical music while conducting the selections. With a simple gesture, he determined the fate of thousands. Most were sent directly to the gas chambers. But certain prisoners caught his attention, especially twins. Part 3. Obsession with twins. Mengele's obsession with twins came from his mentor, Ottmar von Verschuer, who believed twins were the key to unlocking the secrets of heredity. If scientists could understand why twins were genetically identical, they believed they could learn how to reproduce desired traits: blonde hair, blue eyes, physical strength. To Mengele, Auschwitz became a laboratory with unlimited human subjects. When twins arrived at the camp, guards were ordered to shout one word: Zwilling. Twins were pulled from the crowd and taken to special barracks. At first, their conditions seemed better than other prisoners. They received extra food. They were not immediately sent to forced labor. Children were even allowed to keep their clothes. But this was not kindness. It was preparation. They were being preserved for experiments. Part 4. The experiments begin inside crude laboratory rooms at Auschwitz II-Birkenau. The twins were subjected to brutal procedures. Blood was drawn repeatedly, sometimes to the point of collapse. Children were injected with unknown chemicals. Diseases were deliberately introduced to study reactions. If one twin died, the other was often killed immediately, so their bodies could be compared in autopsy. Former prisoners later described surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. Organs were removed. Limbs were amputated. Children screamed in pain while assistants took notes. The experiments had little scientific value. They were chaotic, cruel, and driven by obsession rather than real research. But for Mengele, each victim was merely data. Part 5. Eye color experiments. Another chilling project involved attempts to change eye color. Nazi ideology glorified blue eyes as a symbol of Aryan purity. Mengele wanted to discover whether eye color could be artificially altered. Children were injected with chemicals directly into their eyes. The injections caused terrible pain. Infections spread quickly. Some victims went blind. Others died from complications. When children with unusual eye colors died, their eyes were sometimes removed and sent to research institutes in Germany. These grotesque practices blurred the line between medicine and madness. Yet inside the camp, they continued with terrifying regularity. Part 6. Roma prisoners, not only Jewish prisoners, suffered under Mengele's experiments. The Roma population imprisoned at Auschwitz also became targets. Entire families were kept together in a section known as the Gypsy Camp. Mengele frequently visited these barracks. He selected individuals for blood tests, disease experiments, and anatomical studies. Children were again the primary victims. Many were deliberately infected with illnesses to observe how the disease progressed. Few survived. Part 7. The cult of science. How could educated doctors participate in such cruelty? The answer lies in the ideology of the time. Within the Nazi system, physicians were taught that they were healing the body of a nation. If certain groups were considered a disease, eliminating them was framed as a form of medical treatment. This twisted logic allowed men like Josef Mengele to believe they were serving science. But the reality inside Auschwitz told another story. It was not science. It was systematic torture disguised as research. Part 8. The end of the war. By 1944, the tide of the war was turning. The Allied invasion of Normandy and Soviet advances from the east signaled the collapse of Nazi Germany. As the Red Army approached Poland, the SS began evacuating Auschwitz. Documents were burned. Evidence was destroyed. Prisoners were forced on brutal death marches. And Mengele disappeared. He fled the camp just days before Soviet troops arrived in January 1945. Part 9. Escape and hiding. Unlike many Nazi officials captured after the war, Josef Mengele managed to escape. For several years, he hid in Germany using false identities. Later, with the help of networks that smuggled former Nazis out of Europe, he fled to Argentina. In the 1950s, Buenos Aires had become a refuge for many Nazi fugitives. There, Mengele lived quietly, even using his real name at times. But the world was slowly catching up. The capture of Adolf Eichmann in 1960 by Israeli agents sparked renewed efforts to hunt down other war criminals. Mengele fled again, first to Paraguay, then to Brazil. Part 10. The final years. For decades, rumors circulated. Sightings were reported across South America. Some believed he had died. Others feared he was still hiding. In reality, Mengele spent his final years living under assumed identities, moving between remote farms and safe houses. In 1979, while swimming near the Brazilian coast, he suffered a stroke and drowned. For years, his death went unconfirmed. Only in 1985 did investigators finally identify his remains. The man known as the Angel of Death has escaped justice in life. Conclusion. Lessons from the horror of the story of Josef Mengele is not just a tale of one man's cruelty. It is a warning about how science can be corrupted by ideology. Doctors, researchers, and educated professionals participated in crimes that shocked the world. In response, the international community created strict medical ethics rules, including the Nuremberg Code, which established a principle of informed consent in human experimentation. The victims of Auschwitz left behind testimony that ensures these crimes will never be forgotten. Their stories remind us that the line between civilization and barbarism can be dangerously thin.